Hello, whispers in the dark viewers. In today's video, I will tell you our Marks of Despair story. You may feel scared while listening to this story. If you are ready for horror and mystery, let's start. The first rays of dawn crept over Millbrook's fog-laden streets, casting long shadows across weathered buildings and empty storefronts. Something was different. Something was wrong. Ethan Carter's phone buzzed relentlessly, each notification a sharp interruption to the early morning silence. As a journalist who had returned to his hometown just weeks ago, he was used to the occasional small-town gossip. But this was different. "They're everywhere," whispered Mrs. Henderson, her voice trembling through the phone. "These marks, dark, like bruises, but not quite." Ethan rubbed his temple, his journalistic skepticism rising. "Slow down. What marks?" Across town, Sarah Jennings stared in horror at her own arm. A strange, intricate dark pattern wound its way from her wrist to her elbow, its edges seeming to pulse with a life of its own. Her teenage son Jake stood beside her, his own arm similarly marked. "Mom," Jake's voice cracked. "What's happening?" Sarah's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. Protective, anxious. "We're going to figure this out," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. By mid-morning, the town square was a cauldron of panic and confusion. People compared marks, whispered theories, their voices a nervous chorus of fear and speculation. Margaret Wells, the town's elderly historian, watched from the periphery, her weathered hands clutching an old leather-bound journal. Ethan arrived, notebook in hand, his journalist's eye scanning the crowd. He approached Margaret, who seemed more contemplative than frightened. "You've seen something like this before," he stated more than asked. Margaret's eyes, sharp despite her age, met his. "Not exactly, but something similar. Long ago, the town meeting was called for noon. The community center, usually a place of bake sales and local elections, now felt like a war room. Mayor Thompson tried to maintain order, but the tension was palpable. These marks appeared overnight," he announced, his voice attempting authority but betraying underlying fear. "Does anyone know anything?" Silence. Then a voice from the back. Tom Richardson, a local construction worker, stood up. His mark was different, darker, more aggressive. "They're doing something to us," he muttered, "making us feel things." Jake leaned closer to his mother, sensing something shifting in the room. The marks seemed to pulse, almost imperceptibly. Suddenly, Tom's demeanor changed. His eyes glazed, muscles tensing. Before anyone could react, he grabbed a chair and hurled it across the room, narrowly missing a group of children. Chaos erupted. Ethan watched, his journalist's detachment momentarily shattered. Something was fundamentally wrong. These weren't just marks. They were something else. Sarah pulled Jake closer, her protective instincts flaring. Margaret watched, her expression a mixture of recognition and dread. As the meeting dissolved into panic, no one noticed the marks subtly shifting, growing slightly darker with each passing moment. Outside, the fog seemed to thicken, pressing against the community center's windows like a living thing. Something was awakening in Millbrook. Something old, something hungry, and it had only just begun. By evening, rumors were spreading faster than the mysterious marks. Some claimed they were a disease. Others whispered about supernatural intervention. But everyone felt it, a fundamental wrongness that couldn't be explained. Ethan sat in his small rental home, surrounded by notes and newspaper clippings. The marks, the sudden change in behavior, something connected them, and he was determined to find out what. His phone buzzed. Another text. Another report of strange behavior. Something was coming, and Millbrook would never be the same. The morning after the town meeting, Millbrook awoke to an atmosphere thick with dread. The fog that had lingered the day before now blanketed the streets, muffling sounds and turning the town into an eerie labyrinth. The marks on the townspeople's skin had grown darker, their pulsing more pronounced, as if they were alive and feeding on something unseen. Ethan Carter stood at his desk, staring at the haphazard notes and sketches he'd made. The journalist in him sought a pattern, but all he could see were fragments. Mrs. Henderson's trembling voice, Tom Richardson's outburst, and the way the marks seemed to shift in the dim light. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Sarah Jennings, her face pale and drawn. Jake stood behind her, his arm hidden under a long sleeve. Margaret Wells followed, clutching her ancient leather journal as if it were a lifeline. "We need answers," Sarah said, her voice taut with urgency. Ethan nodded, gesturing them inside. "I've been digging through old records. There's something, a story, but it's thin." He turned to Margaret. "You said you've seen something like this before?" Margaret placed the journal on the table, her hands trembling. "Not exactly this, but close. There was an incident long before any of us were born. A story of a curse tied to the town's founding. They called it the Scourge. The marks were a sign, they said, of something buried. Something that should have stayed buried." As Margaret spoke, Jake shifted uncomfortably. The marks on his arm felt hotter now, almost burning beneath his sleeve. He glanced at his mother, debating whether to say something, but decided against it. Instead, he mumbled, "I'm going out for a bit." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Jake, no. It's not safe." "I'll be fine," he snapped, pulling free. His frustration boiled over, a mix of teenage defiance and the marks' growing influence. He stormed out before anyone could stop him. In the streets, the fog had grown so dense that visibility was limited to a few feet. Jake wandered aimlessly, his thoughts clouded. He wasn't alone for long. A group of teenagers, similarly marked, emerged from the mist. Their eyes were wild, their laughter hollow and unsettling. "Hey, Jennings," one of them sneered. "What's the matter? Afraid of a little mark?" Jake squared his shoulders, trying to project confidence. "Not afraid of anything." The group closed in, their movements jerky and unnatural. One of them, a tall boy named Travis, held out his arm. His mark writhed like ink suspended in water. "Feels like it's alive, doesn't it?" Travis hissed. Jake felt his pulse quicken. The air around them seemed heavier, and a strange compulsion tugged at his mind, urging him to prove himself. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Let's find out how alive," he challenged. The group laughed, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. Somewhere in the distance, a low, guttural noise echoed through the fog. It was enough to stop the laughter. "What was that?" one of the teens whispered. Jake felt the hair on his neck rise. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. But the others seemed rooted in place, their marks pulsing faster, as if in response to the sound. Back at Ethan's house, Sarah paced nervously while Ethan and Margaret pored over the historian's journal. "There's a pattern," Margaret said, pointing to a faded sketch of a symbol that resembled the marks. "The marks appear when the town is at its weakest, during times of division, fear, and loss. They're drawn to conflict, feeding on it." Ethan frowned. "So what are they? A curse? A manifestation of collective guilt?" Margaret hesitated. "Perhaps both, or neither. But the legend says the marks are tied to an old injustice. Something the town buried, literally, and never made right." Sarah stopped pacing. "Jake's out there. If these marks are feeding on fear, he's in danger." She grabbed her coat. "We need to find him." Ethan stood as well. "We'll go together." The fog thickened as they searched the streets, their calls for Jake swallowed by the oppressive silence. The town felt deserted, the few residents they encountered peering out from behind curtains, their marks visible even in the dim light. Some were crying, others stared blankly, as if in a trance. At the edge of the park, they found Jake, shaken but unharmed. The other teens were gone, but Jake's mark had grown darker, more intricate, spiraling toward his shoulder. "They're changing," he muttered, his voice trembling. "The marks, they're not just on us. They're inside us." Sarah hugged him tightly, her fear momentarily eclipsed by relief. Ethan exchanged a grim look with Margaret. They needed answers, and fast. That night, Ethan delved deeper into the town's archives, piecing together fragments of the old legend. The scourge had come before, during a time of great unrest. The marks had driven the townspeople to madness, forcing them to confront their darkest impulses. The only way to stop it, according to the legend, was to uncover the truth behind the town's greatest secret. A truth no one seemed to remember, or perhaps no one wanted to. Outside, the fog coiled tighter around Millbrook, its presence almost suffocating. The marks pulsed rhythmically on the arms of the townspeople, synchronizing with their heartbeats. Something old had awakened, and it was far from finished. By the time the fog lifted slightly the next morning, Millbrook had already changed. The streets were tense, a pressure building like the moments before a thunderstorm. The marks, now darker and more intricate, seemed to hum with an invisible energy. In the town square, arguments broke out as neighbors turned against each other, their fears and frustrations boiling over. Ethan Carter watched from the steps of the town hall, his journalist's notebook open but forgotten. Two men, normally friendly acquaintances, were shouting at each other over a trivial disagreement about parking. One shoved the other, and a crowd quickly formed. Shouts turned into jeers, and the situation teetered dangerously close to violence. Margaret Wells appeared beside him, her weathered face etched with concern. "It's starting," she said softly. Ethan frowned. "What's starting?" She gestured at the crowd. "The marks don't just feed on fear, they amplify it. They push people to act on their worst impulses. This town is a powder keg, Ethan, and the marks are the spark." At home, Sarah Jennings sat across from Jake, her expression a mixture of worry and anger. His mark had grown again, now creeping toward his collarbone. He avoided her gaze, slouched in his chair like a petulant child. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling. "What were you thinking? Wandering off like that, with everything that's happening?" Jake shot her a defiant look. "I'm not a kid, Mom. I can handle myself." "Handle yourself?" she snapped, her voice rising. "You've seen what's happening to people. These marks, whatever they are, they're dangerous. And you're not immune to them." Jake stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get it. You're just scared, like everyone else. But I'm not going to let these stupid marks control me." Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Jake, listen to me. I'm trying to keep you safe." The tension broke as Jake wrenched his arm free, glaring at her. "Maybe I don't need you to," he yelled before storming out, slamming the door behind him. Sarah sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. She felt helpless, the fear for her son gnawing at her resolve. Meanwhile, Ethan and Margaret had retreated to the historian's cluttered study. Books and papers were strewn everywhere, each containing fragments of Millbrook's past. Margaret pulled out an old, faded map of the town, her finger tracing a circle around a patch of forest on the outskirts. "There," she said, "that's where it started. The old settlement, long before Millbrook became what it is now. There was a tragedy, no, a massacre. The settlers turned on each other, driven by paranoia and fear. The marks appeared then too." Ethan leaned in, his skepticism wavering. "Why hasn't anyone talked about this? Why isn't it in the town's official history?" Margaret smiled bitterly. "Because history is written by those who survive. The marks aren't just a curse. They're a warning, a scar left by what happened. And until the truth of that tragedy is faced, the cycle will keep repeating." As night fell, the tension in town reached a breaking point. People gathered in the square again, shouting over one another, their accusations and fears swirling in the thick air. A fight broke out, and this time it wasn't contained. Someone threw a bottle, and the sound of breaking glass sent the crowd into a frenzy. Ethan and Sarah arrived just in time to witness the chaos. "We have to stop this," Sarah said, but her voice was drowned out by the commotion. A scream cut through the noise, freezing everyone in place. A woman stumbled into the square, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "It's Henry," she gasped. "He's gone. Just gone." The crowd murmured, the panic shifting to unease. Ethan pushed through, reaching the woman. "What do you mean, gone? What happened?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I saw him walk into the fog. I tried to stop him, but he just disappeared. Like the fog swallowed him." The crowd began to disperse, fear etched into their faces. Ethan turned to Sarah and Margaret, his expression grim. We don't have much time. Whatever's happening, it's escalating. Back at Margaret's study, the trio regrouped. The historian flipped through her journal, stopping at a passage written in shaky handwriting. The last time the marks appeared, she read aloud, the town's founders sealed something away. Something they believed caused the madness. But they didn't destroy it. They buried it. Ethan nodded. And now it's back. Margaret closed the journal, her hands trembling. We need to find where they buried it. And we need to do it before the marks consume this town completely. Outside, the fog thickened once more, curling through the streets like a living thing. Somewhere in the distance, a low, haunting sound echoed, a reminder that whatever was coming had only just begun. The forest loomed before them, dense and foreboding, its twisted branches shrouded in the oppressive fog that clung to Millbrook like a curse. Ethan, Sarah, Margaret, and an uncharacteristically quiet Jake stood at the edge, staring into the shadows. In Margaret's hand was the faded map she'd uncovered, pointing the way to the place where the settlers had buried their secrets. "This is it," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the dread in her eyes. "The answers we seek lie in there." Ethan adjusted the flashlight in his hand, the journalist's skepticism that once defined him now tempered by the strange and inexplicable events. He glanced at Sarah, who clutched Jake's hand tightly, her determination etched into every line of her face. Jake avoided her gaze, guilt hanging over him like the fog. "Let's move," Ethan said, stepping into the forest. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed alive. The fog swirled unnaturally, whispering sounds echoing from unseen places. Shadows shifted, and shapes emerged in the periphery, disappearing when looked at directly. Margaret stopped suddenly, her breath hitching. "Do you see it?" she whispered. Before them stood a crumbling stone altar, partially buried beneath moss and roots. Around it, the ground was littered with bones, animal and human, indistinguishable in their decay. The air here felt heavier, thicker, as if the forest itself resisted their presence. "This is where they buried it," Margaret said, pointing to the altar. Ethan stepped forward, but as he did, a wave of cold washed over him. His flashlight flickered, and a voice whispered in his ear, soft and insidious. "Coward," it hissed. "You never finish what you start." Ethan froze. The voice was his own, twisted with malice. The forest wasn't just alive. It was sentient, feeding on their fears. Sarah gasped as the fog around her coalesced into a vision. Jake as a small child, crying for her. "You weren't there," the apparition accused. "Always working, always distracted." "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "That's not true. I've always loved you, Jake." The vision dissolved, but the guilt remained. She looked at her son, who stood still, his face pale. Jake saw them too, the faces of the kids he had bullied, the times he had lied, the reckless choices he'd made. "You don't deserve a second chance," a shadow of himself sneered. But as the visions clawed at his resolve, he looked at his mother, her expression a mix of fear and love. He clenched his fists. "I'll prove I'm better," he muttered, stepping closer to her. Margaret placed her hand on the altar. Her voice was steady but laced with sorrow. "This is why the marks returned. This town never faced what it did, the betrayal, the bloodshed. Those settlers turned on each other, and instead of acknowledging it, they buried the truth. And now it's festering." "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Margaret closed her eyes. "We confront it." The fog thickened, and a figure emerged from it, dark and monstrous. It bore no distinct features but shifted constantly, reflecting fragments of each of their fears. It was the embodiment of the marks, a physical manifestation of guilt, pain, and secrets long buried. The figure's voice echoed, deep and resonant. "You cannot destroy what is within you. You cannot escape yourselves." Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady. "We're not here to escape. We're here to face it." The figure hesitated, as if thrown off by his defiance. It lashed out and the visions intensified. But Ethan held firm, turning to the others. "We need to confront what it's showing us. Accept it and let it go." Margaret spoke first, We've all made mistakes, but hiding from them gives them power. I won't do that anymore. The altar beneath her hands glowed faintly, and the figure recoiled. Sarah turned to Jake. I wasn't always there for you, but I'm here now, and I will protect you, no matter what. The fog around her lifted slightly, and the figure flickered. Jake took a shaky breath. I've done bad things, hurt people, but I want to change. His mark began to fade as he stepped closer to the altar, placing his hand on it beside Margaret's. Ethan followed, his voice calm. I've run from things I didn't understand, but not anymore. The marks on their bodies pulsed, then dimmed as a warm light radiated from the altar. The fog dissipated, and the figure let out an unearthly howl before dissolving into nothingness. The forest grew silent, and the oppressive weight that had hung over Millbrook lifted. The marks on their bodies were gone, replaced by faint scars, a reminder, but not a curse. Back in town, the fog cleared entirely, and the tension that had gripped the townspeople began to ease. Neighbors who had fought embraced, and whispers of forgiveness spread through the square. Ethan, Sarah, Jake, and Margaret returned, weary but resolute. They had confronted the darkness, not just in the forest but within themselves. As they parted ways, Ethan glanced at the sunset over Millbrook, a flicker of hope in his chest. The town would heal, but it would take time and truth. The marks were gone, but their lesson remained. Only by confronting the darkness within could they find the light. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked our video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like our video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments.